All right. So rather than do a deep dive on forms today, I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios. I'm going to also review a form that we have recently created in response to the NAR's settlement proposal. Okay. Now, mind you, none of this has gone into effect yet, but it's still slated to go into effect in July. We'll see if that actually happens or not. But here's the scenario, right? Buyers agents, or buyers rather, have been now told by the news, which we all know is a reliable source for credible information. They've been told by the news that buyers agents are no longer necessary because you can find your home on the internet all by yourself. Technology has increased to the point where you can now find your home all by yourself, so you don't need a buyer's agent. And the ignorance of that is just absolutely mind-blowing. How do these people even call themselves reporters? They ask no questions. They don't talk to any. I mean, it blows my mind how dumb that report is. But the public somehow hasn't learned to do any of their own due diligence. And so it's up to us to educate them. So here's the problem. Here's the first scenario that I'm going to give you. You are a listing agent. Somebody comes up to you and says, hey, I saw on the news that I don't have to pay this buyer agent commission, so I'm going to do this work myself. I found the home myself online. I don't need anybody to help me, and I want to make an offer on this home. And you're like, okay. Now in Utah, it's legal to be a limited agent to, help both sides with paperwork. They say, nope, I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to make an offer, and it's going to be for 3% less, or if they're super ignorant, they're going to make the offer for 6% less, thinking I'm doing this work myself, therefore I should be afforded a discount on the home. And so they want to make an offer. What challenges does that create? Just, you can unmute yourself and throw them out. What challenges does that create for you, the listing agent? What problems do you foresee?
They don't know the steps. They don't know the forms. They don't know anything.
Okay, so what's the first step? The forms, right? Where are they going to get the forms?
Hard to say, online or something, but it opens up to us to a lot of liability.
Yeah, so they're going to jump online and they're going to Google real estate purchase forms. They're probably not even going to, I don't know. I've seen people Google it and they pull up forms from other states. And they don't know any better. They don't know that the form to purchase for California is different than the one for Utah and for pretty much every state. So they Google something, pull up a form. You're the listing agent. So they write an offer.
Does the division still have forms on their site?
Let's jump there. I'm going to jump to share screen here. All right. Here's the Division of Real Estate. Let me backtrack a little bit to show you where I went. So when you first go into the Division of Real Estate website, realestate.utah.gov, right? Then you can scroll down here and there's the different categories. So we click on real estate, and then you can click on forms. Now this is public, okay? This isn't something that realtors only have access to. You click on forms, and then you go down here to state approved forms. So I want you to see the number of forms and the forms themselves that are available for the public to use. All right, we've got our standard real estate purchase contract. We've got the FHA VA loan addendum. We've got a seller financing addendum, and we've got a blank addendum. If they want to hold the title company or earnest money with the title company, they've got that addendum there. And then they've got some stuff that are very obscure stuff that most people don't use. The assumption addendum, the buyer financial information sheet to be used with the seller financing addendum, lead-based paint disclosure, lead-based paint addendum. Notice that seller's disclosures aren't in here. right? So if you've got a for sale by owner and they're required to provide you with seller's disclosures, they don't have access to that. That is a form created by the Utah Association of Realtors. You've got your all-inclusive trust deed, and yay, the all-inclusive promissory note secured by an all-inclusive trust deed. Folks, if this was your toolbox, how many problems can you solve with these tools?
You can create quite a few.
You can create quite a few. Nothing but the very most basic transaction can be solved with a real estate purchase contract and a blank addendum. Right? Now, why would you have a form, or in what scenarios would you be in where those are the only two addenda that you use? Well, if, for example, somebody's priced their home really low, and so everybody knows it but them. You know, this happens with a for sale by owner situation, right? They're priced $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 below market value. Do you deal with appraisal issues? No. So you're not going to have a problem there. Do you deal with inspection issues? No. Nobody wants to raise the flag on that because they're like, hey, we're getting a killer deal here. So if it's that simple and straightforward, there's probably a ton of money left on the table, right? What if they've got a home to sell? The people buying your home have a home to sell. Can't solve that problem here, right? There are so many different issues. In fact, let me share a different screen here. We'll go from this one, and I'll go out of this one. And we're just, for the sake of the recording, I'm going to show you all of the different forms that we have available to us as real estate agents, because I make my recordings public. So somebody could be looking at this and say, okay, well, what does a realtor bring to the table? Well, here's the forms for listings, specifically for listings. We've got a bunch of these ones. For buyers, we've got all of these. Keep on going. That's a lot, right? We've got a few miscellaneous ones, mostly for the MLS. Then we've got a few other addenda that don't necessarily fall specifically under a listing or a buyer category, but they all come into play. Some leases, appraisals, and then some commercial forms. All of these forms are created, and everything with stars on them, which is almost all of them, are copyrighted by the Utah Association of Realtors. It's their attorneys that have created these forms based on lawsuits and problems, complaints where people are fighting with each other. And so we've created forms that solve those problems. That doesn't even take into consideration some of these different forms over here that are, you know, basic forms to help us get the job done correctly. So we have now, I'm going to do a new share. Well, before I do that, let me go back to this okay, let's go to the unrepresented buyer disclosure form. All right, so let's say that we are in this situation where we're the listing agent, an unrepresented buyer who's uneducated or educated by the media, which is almost worse than being uneducated. They come up and they say, we want to make an offer on the home. We're going to offer 3% less because we're doing all the work ourselves. Well, currently the form that we have available to give them is this unrepresented buyer disclosure. And all it does is describe in a simple paragraph a seller's agent. Basically, we're looking after the seller's interest. It defines what a buyer's agent does, how they look after the buyer's interest. It explains an agent in Utah can be a limited agent representing both parties, and it explains how that works. And then it says in bold that the buyer is only representing the seller in this transaction, and we've advised the buyer that they could have their own agent, but the buyer has elected not to have their own agent. What does that mean? To an uneducated buyer, it means nothing. to many agents that don't receive training like you guys are today, it doesn't mean much either. And so we see this as an emerging problem. This is basically a CYA form, a cover your ass form that realtors have an unrepresented buyer sign saying, hey, we're not looking after your interests here. You need to be aware of that. Because that was a problem 25 years ago before we had the rules in place that are kind of being rolled back with this settlement agreement. So I want to take you to the form that we're creating here at Equity for our agents. Now, in this case, a buyer comes up to you and they say the same thing. We're making an offer. We don't have an agent. We want a discount. Okay. So what we can say to them now is, all right, I'm going to need you to sign this form. Now, this educates both the client or the unrepresented person. They're not actually a client. The unrepresented buyer, it educates them and it educates the agent about what we can and can't do. So the company represents the seller in this transaction and has duties including loyalty and confidentiality only to the seller. Because of this, the company cannot and will not provide buyer with assistance for any of the following. We won't give you an opinion of value of the property or market information. So if they say, how do you come to this price or anything like that? We say, we've done our research. We don't have to give them a CMA, right? If they had a buyer's agent, they could have a CMA, that's a comparative market analysis, done for them. But we're representing the seller. And if we share that information, it could be potentially negatively affecting the seller. So we're not going to share that information. Any value or market information provided by the company is for the purpose of marketing the property and is not to be relied upon by the buyer as any assurance of value. Because what if this buyer comes back later on and says, well, I thought you were, which is a problem that used to happen a long time ago. I didn't understand that this agent wasn't helping me out. I thought that I was paying a fair value. How come they presented this value? Well, it's because we're trying to get the most value for the seller. It's the buyer's sole responsibility to evaluate the value of the property and the relevant market as a condition of the buyer purchasing the property. Okay. Assistance in drafting offers or counteroffers. The company may provide the buyer with a blank state-approved real estate purchase contract and blank addendum, but cannot assist the buyer in filling out these forms. Now, why can we provide them with that? And I wouldn't even provide them with it. I'd say go to utah.realestate.gov, and there are some blank forms there that you can use. At least that way, you're not giving me some California form and I just have to throw it out, you know, right? But I can't help you in filling it out. So if I'm not helping them fill it out, could it have mistakes in it? Yeah. Could some of those mistakes be used against them?
Absolutely.
Would it be wrong to use their own mistakes against them? Is it morally wrong? Is it ethically wrong? Is it illegal?
I would say no, because they're choosing to do this on their own. They are an unrepresented buyer.
That's right. That's why we have this advisory. And in fact, if we go through and coach them on how to fill it out correctly and we correct all of their mistakes, we may be closing holes that our seller could use to get a better deal.
Plus, it creates implied agency.
And it creates implied agency.
So is that going to change with these new set of rules? Is that implied agency going to go away under this circumstance, or is it going to stay there?
No, it's going to bite a whole bunch of agents. That's why we're creating this form, because it tells our agents exactly what they can do, and it tells the public, because that form created by the UAR does nothing. It describes buyer agency, listing agency, limited agency, and it says that the buyer's been advised they can have an agent, but they've, in bold, determined that they're not going to have one. But that doesn't tell them what that means. This form tells them what that means. We're not going to assist them in meeting any of their deadlines. So they're going to have several deadlines by contract in here. this doesn't help them meet those deadlines. For example, one of the deadlines in the purchase contract is to, your due diligence deadline. Now, we know that that means, because we've read the contract in detail, we know that that means that all of our due diligence issues must be resolved by that deadline. A lot of people that don't know this, even many agents that don't attend training, think that as long as I get my inspections done by that deadline, I'm good. And so if my due diligence deadline is tomorrow at 5 p.m., and some of them don't even know it's 5 p.m., they think it's tomorrow at midnight. So they've got their inspection scheduled for tomorrow at 3 o'clock. The inspector finishes the job at 5 o'clock. They do the walkthrough by 5:30. At 6 o'clock, you get an addendum saying, hey, here's some of the issues that came up in our inspection. And the seller says, tough. Your deadline was over an hour ago. Well, no, our deadline's midnight. No, it isn't. You didn't read the contract. You don't understand it. Okay. And it is our job to the seller not to explain that to the buyer, because it does create agency by implication. So we're not going to assist the buyer in conducting their due diligence and financing. The buyer is solely responsible for conducting their own due diligence of the property, including selecting, coordinating, and paying for any inspectors that the buyer wishes to use. The company can't recommend any inspectors, lenders, appraisers, or title companies for the buyer. We're not going to recommend anybody to them. We are not representing them. The company can't provide the buyer with any advice about the physical condition of the property or advice about tax or legal matters. The buyer will be solely responsible for ensuring that the property is suitable for their purchase. The buyer's advised to evaluate all aspects of the property, including but not limited to building code, zoning, etc., radon gas, surveys, home warranty plans, flood insurance, homeowners insurance, title issues, physical condition and square footage, utility services, property taxes, income tax, or legal consequences. By now, this buyer should be realizing, wow, a buyer's agent seems to do more than simply finding the house for me online. But there's even more. We're not going to hold their earnest money for them in our trust account. Okay, they're going to have to coordinate with the title company to hold this deposit. Now, you did notice that one of the state forms was the addendum to do this. So they're going to need that addendum. We're not going to review the disclosure documents, title documents. This includes HOA documents, CC&Rs, bylaws, financial statements, etc. And of course, we're not going to help them. It says very clearly, our fiduciary duties are to the seller and not you. Therefore, the company cannot and will not negotiate on your behalf. We'll present all offers and counteroffers you submit to them, but the company cannot advocate for you presenting those offers or counteroffers. And then they sign it. So this is something that we have created and we should have available to you guys shortly. So if you're faced with this situation, please let me know, and we'll be making this available to you in dotloop for our agents. But this is going to be a challenge that I think we're going to be faced with more and more of. And even if we're not, this form is so much better than the current UAR form. And in fact, I've talked with, when I went to our attorney and asked them to start working on something like this, and I gave them a lot of the details that we've put in here, I also talked to, and our attorney talked to the forms committee, but I've talked to our CEO of our local board, and he has discussions with the forms committee as well. So we may see something like this similar in coming days from the UAR, and we may choose to go with theirs or use ours depending on which one we like the best. But for now, this one is so much more protective of the agent and so much more clearly defining the scope of what a buyer will be responsible for on their own if they choose to proceed without representation. Do you see how you need to use this?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So are we gonna start using this as soon as it's available? I mean, the law hasn't gone into effect yet. So where do we stand?
The law hasn't gone into effect, but the news is already out. And I've
Right.
already had agents calling me faced with scenarios like this.
Okay.
So yeah, we're working on our final draft of it. But if you're faced with a scenario like this, let me know and I can have the attorney remove that draft bit of it, because basically I presented this to all of our brokers last week in our Utah broker meeting, and everybody was in favor of adopting it. So we're moving ahead with it. So I'm sharing it with you guys because we've got the green light. And our attorney's just putting the final touches on it. But
Well-
if you're faced with this scenario, we'll have solutions for you.
Okay, if you get a buyer and they start asking you questions about this NAR settlement and stuff, can't you right now just say, look, it's there, it hasn't been ratified yet, so it's not a law yet. So right now, everything in the state of Utah is the same as it's always been? Or do we just go ahead and say, well, yeah, that's there, and this is what we're gonna do, and this is a form you now need to sign? Or, I mean, what is your suggestion on how to handle it?
And just to be clear, that settlement doesn't change the law.
Right,
Okay. It's a settlement agreement for NAR, which affects then how all of the people affiliated with the NAR are expected to act.
right,
The main thing for Utah, in other states that didn't have buyer agency agreements at all, that's a big change for them. 39 other states didn't even have buyer agency agreements. For us, the real only change is a negative one, and it's that we lose the transparency of posting what's offered to a buyer agent for their commission. That transparency is really good because it's uniform. It's offered to everybody, regardless of, any protected category. For example, we offer the same thing to a man versus a woman, black, white, Asian, whatever. It doesn't matter.
right.
Offered to everybody. Now we've lost that transparency as a result of this, frankly, ridiculous settlement agreement. So I anticipate that we'll face further issues because we've lost that transparency. Right.
I agree.
Not only are we faced with that, but it's going to create some financing issues for buyers. For those of you that attended our training last week down at Alan Blood's office, he had a really good training where we talked about what are the limits that a seller can provide concessions for a buyer. And so if we're coming in and negotiating for a seller to pay a buyer's agent's commission, and they also want to negotiate some closing costs or other things, they're going to be bumping up into these restrictions on the lending side as well. So it's going to create a lot of problems for buyers that do need the help. So one of the ways that I would use this form is if I'm meeting with a buyer that's saying, I want to be unrepresented, I would say, do you know what that really entails? And one of the things that isn't put on here, because you can't really put it on paper, is the emotions. All of these things that you're going to be going through, the challenge in finding forms, the stress with making sure that these forms are filled out correctly, staying on top of all of the different people. You've got your lender, you've got your inspector, you've got the appraiser, you've got the title company. They all have to get their jobs done on time. You're responsible for all of that now. You're responsible for interpreting all of the data that we provide you in seller's disclosures, CC&Rs, all of that stuff, the title report. You're responsible for all of that. A lot of times that stress is overwhelming. You get your inspection report back and it's 20 pages. Even on a brand new home, there's going to be issues. You get that report back. How do you handle those things? The stress of those things and the emotional impact or burden of those things kills more deals than almost anything. Almost all of my unrepresented buyer offers that come are killed through those things. It's not through the negotiations. It's not through establishing price or anything like that. It's as they go through the process, they get an inspection that has, frankly, very common concerns about a house. And they're like, oh, shoot, I don't know, it's too much. And they don't have anybody walking them through that, helping them understand. whether it's normal, whether it isn't, resources they have to go to get those things fixed. So I frankly really don't like working with unrepresented buyers because the odds of that deal going through to completion are pretty low. And so having this form and enabling us to have this discussion with an unrepresented buyer and saying, okay, this is all going to be on you. And so here's all the stuff that's going to be on your plate now. And on top of this is the emotional burden of dealing with it all. And so you need to understand the disadvantages that you're going to be in. And by the way, no, you don't get 3% off the price. Okay. We've priced it fair. That's part of my job as a listing agent, is to price it right. It's priced right now. So no, you don't get a discount for making our job harder to sell this home. And yes, I would be that direct and blunt to an unrepresented buyer. You do not get a discount for increasing our risk that this home won't sell to you. You don't get a discount for me having to direct you to where the forms are, for me having to constantly go back and say, you filled this form out incorrectly, please do it right so that we can entertain your offer. You don't get a discount for making this more challenging for the seller. So yeah, go ahead and do all the work yourself. That's great. You can do it. This is what you're in for. We're not going to help you with it. And no, you don't get a discount for making it more difficult. Be that direct with people. And then this form tells you where you don't cross the line in trying to be helpful. Because in trying to be helpful and get that deal done for the seller, you do not only put yourself at risk, and by the way, you will be much more at risk after this settlement agreement. Okay. Much more people. And in fact, there were 25 years ago, from what I understand, I've been in the business 21 now. But from what I understand, about 25 years ago, before this was more common, that these types of buyer complaints against listing agents were so common that that's why we evolved to where we're at now. Because buyers were complaining, well, I thought this person was supposed to help me, or, you know, how come I didn't have anybody looking after me? How come this person let this stuff go? It's because we don't, our job isn't to you. Our job is specifically to the seller, and your mistakes give my seller an advantage. Period. Okay. Me correcting your mistakes violates my fiduciary duty to my seller. Right? We all clear on that?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's move on. Another one that I want to go over with you here is some of our tools. Okay, so rather than doing a deep dive, I want to make sure that we're aware of some of the tools that we have available to us. So I'm going to go to, again, back to the MLS. I'm going to go to our forms. I'm going to pull up the basic real estate purchase contract here. All right. And here's your scenario. This came up just this morning, and I thought it was a great one to cover. We are the listing agent. We have a buyer that brought us an offer yesterday, subject to the sale of their home. Okay, their home is not under contract, and so we have countered them with the option to keep house on market time clause addendum, and they could accept that any minute now. We have also gotten, but by the way, I'm going to give you the full scenario. The buyer's agent is not very responsive. So we've gone back to them and they're like, okay, we got it. Okay, when can we anticipate a response? Anyways, they're not responding very well. Okay, so we've got a buyer's agent that's not very responsive to our listing agent. And now today we got a better offer. It's still subject to sell, but it's already under contract. Now that first subject to sell, also, we looked into that a little bit deeper, and it's in a more remote area where the economy isn't as good and homes are going into, there's more foreclosures and stuff happening in that area because the economy is not doing so well, versus our second offer is in Salt Lake, and there's a lot of demand and it's already under contract. But we've countered the first one. So what do we do? Are we bound to go with the first one because we've already countered them? That's the first question.
Cancel it.
Cancel it.
Well, or you could do a multiple offer scenario, but basically you've got to cancel that counter.
Okay, how do we do that?
Call the agent on the other side and let them know we're withdrawing our counter.
Okay.
There's
let
a
me
form
take-
on the MLS to rescind the counteroffer.
Yeah, thank you. I want to show you this section here. Except as provided in section 23, all notices required under the purchase contract must be A, in writing, B, signed by the buyer or seller giving notice, and C, received by the other party, either the buyer, seller, or their agent. We've got to be in writing, signed by the client, and received. So is it sufficient to email them and say, or call them and say, hey, we are rescinding or revoking or withdrawing our counteroffer? Now, by the way, a lot of these notices were not created for us. And we've been all operating, 21 years. We didn't have any notices created for us for most of that time. Just in the last couple of years, have our attorneys actually gone through. So remember, this is a state approved form. This purchase contract is a state form. And in this form, it has these rules of how notices need to be given, but we haven't had the paperwork to be able to do it until recent years. And so if we go back to our forms, and if you ever are unsure on how to find a form, this one would be a notice. So we can type in notice, and then you can read through this list right here. And would it be a seller's notice of cancellation? No, that would be for the contract. You could open it up and read it, but there's this seller's notice of withdrawal of counteroffer. How many of us knew that tool existed? So great form to be able to solve a problem, right? But we need to have it in writing, signed by the client. And so if we pull this up, and by the way, there's also one for the buyer, a buyer's notice of withdrawal of counteroffer. This document serves as formal written notice that the seller withdraws the seller's counteroffer, signed by the seller. They don't have to accept it. There is no form or spot for the buyer to accept it or anything. So again, if you used a regular blank addendum, that could be confusing, because then you've got an option there for the, in this case, it would be the seller withdrawing it. There's an option there for a buyer to accept that. A buyer could say, well, I didn't accept that, so it's not incorporated into the contract. You've created confusion. Is this form available to the public? Nope.
Nope.
This is a UAR copyrighted form. You can go down to the bottom and see it's copyrighted. Okay. So copyright, wow, 8 years already. So a lot of these notices are new for us to use. Well, I consider them new. I loved it when they came out. They started creating notices like one after the other several years ago. So a lot of people that have been in business for a long time don't even know that these forms are there for them. So I want to make sure that you guys are aware of all of the forms, and an easy way to find them is when you go to the available forms and you think you know the general idea of what it is. If you can even remember one word in it, you can type that word in up here in the search bar, and it will shorten that list to, it'll shorten that list to just the different notices that you can give. All right, so I want you guys to be aware of that one. All right, now I want to open it up to you guys. What kind of challenges are you guys seeing? Anything?
I haven't seen this challenge yet, but during this conversation, I started thinking, well, how's it going? Has there been any feedback or any, I don't know what word I want to use here, from builders saying, you know, with buyers? I mean, that's really not going to change, is it?
The builders that I've talked about have been very upfront saying, hey, this is our opportunity. In fact, one of them, the CEO, said, hey, maybe we don't need to offer a buyer agent commission now. And the agent that I talked to actually went back to him and said, actually, it's just the opposite of this. This is a huge opportunity for us to build a good reputation with real estate agents. You know, the market has slowed down a little bit. We've got homes sitting for a little bit more. If we want to increase our sales, this is our opportunity to do it. We can offer a commission. And so the few builders that I've talked to have all taken that as an opportunity. And I don't think that that's unilateral with all the different builders out there. I think some of them will probably try to not offer a buyer agent commission. I know that that's a bigger problem down south. It's been a constant problem with all the building in St. George. A lot of the builders, because of the boom times, they haven't been very friendly towards realtors. But when those boom times go away, builders all of a sudden try to get real friendly with realtors. And in a lot of cases, they burn their bridges and they'll close their doors because they're not selling anything. So the builders that I've talked to are mostly up north here, and they're seeing this as an opportunity to reward buyers agents and build better relationships with them. What have you guys seen? Nobody's had conversations there? I've only had two. Okay. Those are the two that I've had. What else? Any other scenario you guys have faced that you'd like to discuss? Those were the primary things that I had prepared for you. I wanted you to be aware of the new unrepresented buyer form. I think that's going to be a big deal for us moving forward. And I think we're going to make that new form a required part of all of our packets too. So you guys are kind of getting the sneak preview of it before we have the final touches on it and incorporate it into everything. And then I wanted to go over some of those notices that are available to you because I get asked questions on those all the time. How do we do this? And quite often those solutions are there within those forms that a lot of agents don't realize are there. So anything else, or do we have a shorter meeting today?
Eric, I have a quick
Yes.
question. Are you
Yeah.
going to be doing the same kind of form for sale by owner?
The for sale by owner, let me share the screen and we'll go back to that one. It is not as bad. This one has a lot more in it than the unrepresented buyer disclosure. So in the for sale by owner, we still have, whether or not they're going to offer to pay the buyer agent commission. There's the protection period. There's the seller warranties and disclosures. The sellers are going to personally complete and sign a seller property condition disclosure form. So this already tells them some of what their job is in the purchase contract. They're going to furnish us with good and marketable title, pay for the standard policy of title insurance. Again, all of these are required in the purchase contract. They're going to inform us of everything they know about the property, complete and sign a seller property condition disclosure form, which they don't have access to, but they're going to have to fill one out to the best of their abilities. And again, very specifically says that we're going to be representing the buyer with our fiduciary duties, and that the seller has been advised that they have the option to have a real estate agent and they've chosen not to. So professional advice that we're not going to be giving the seller or any prospective buyer any legal or tax advice or anything of that. So most of the things that we need are already in here. So this is a much better form than the unrepresented buyer disclosure form. So right now, no, we don't anticipate changing this one up. That's a good question, Rebecca. Do you see problems with this form?
I just really liked in the buyer one that says we're not going to negotiate for you. And it's just, I mean, it's, to me, it's a lot less. I mean, this UAR form is, or the form on the MLS is kind of involved. The other one's just kind of bullet points. This is what you're not going to get. And I really like that. So that
Yeah.
was my question.
Yeah, and I don't know if more people are going to be unrepresented as sellers as a result of this lawsuit, because I think what we'll have more of is sellers saying, okay, now I don't have to offer a buyer agent commission. So I can list it for 3% instead of 6%, or whatever they negotiate for. And as a result of that, sellers not being correctly informed of the value of a buyer's agent as well, then sellers go out and try to sell their home not involving a buyer's agent, and they don't understand those complications either. So I think this opens it all up for us to have better discussions with both buyers and sellers, helping them both understand the value that a buyer's agent brings. Because if a seller is going to pay me a 6% commission, that's my money. I can do what I want with it. But I'm openly disclosing to them, hey, I'm going to give half of this, 3%, or maybe I'm doing a 4% commission. I'm going to give 2% to a buyer's agent. I want to be clear that that's all negotiable. But when I'm saying this to a seller, hey, you're paying me 4% and I'm going to offer 2% of this to a buyer's agent, the seller, I think, should understand the value that that buyer agent brings. Why am I willing to share that commission with the buyer's agent? And some agents out there are kind of ignorant. They're like, it's the brokerage's money. We can do whatever we want with it. Well, sure, but the seller is still paying it. It's still coming out of their pocket. Why would they want to pay that? And so it's good to have that discussion with the seller and say, here's why you want to pay this. This actually helps get your home sold. Because all of these hurdles that a buyer's going to face, if they don't have anybody helping them, and here's the form that I would have to have them sign, I can't help them do this. I can't help them write the offer. I can't help them navigate through all of these challenges, through the inspections, through all of the different due diligence issues that could come up. I can't navigate any of that with them. They're on their own. The odds of them getting that across the finish line, which is what you want, Mr. Seller, the odds of that getting across the finish line are low. So here's why we offer this. Those are the discussions that we need to be having with sellers to help them understand this is why we're not doing a 3% listing agreement, because our goal is to sell the home. And for that to happen, we need buyers to get their deal across the finish line. Does that make sense? So we can all do better in that regard. Okay, cool. If that's it, any last questions or comments or things that you guys would like to discuss? Okay. Alan, do you want to, normally I have you do a mortgage minute at the start. You covered a little bit. We've got more people on here. You covered a little bit in our 9 o'clock group. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on lately in the Take a Mortgage Minute?
Sure. I'll just kind of reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that we're seeing interest rates get real volatile. We're up about a 0.5% rate from where we were just 2 weeks ago. So people who are actively shopping are going to have some payment changes, which just sort of reiterates what we talked about. We did training a couple of months ago, and I was trying to project the market out, and turns out we didn't anticipate some of the Fed issues. But the part that I think we did talk about that's right is we're going to see a lot of volatility in the next 9 to maybe 18 months, where rates are going to yo-yo back and forth. I think it's realistic to expect that rates are going to go from maybe a high 7 to a low 6, and we might scratch a little bit below that and a little bit above that. But in general, I think that's the range we'll see. And I think that range is going to happen back and forth a couple of times this year. So as people are out shopping, I think it'll be really important to not just figure out what their their payment's going to be based on a current rate, but also project a little bit and make sure that the lender they're working with is giving them a payment range of what it could be as rates move up and down. Just so that if you get somebody under contract and they lock 3 days later, suddenly the payment is $75 a month higher, they need to go in knowing there's some volatility. And that'll be a little bit challenging because the default is that people then want to say, well, let's just wait until rates calm down. And unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. A really good corollary for this is interest rates from 2000 to 2006. And you saw interest rates do the same thing about every 3 to 5 months, just moving all over the place. And so helping people understand that the market's a little different than it's been in the past, and that you don't have a rate that's going to be really predictable for an extended period of time. I think it actually brings some urgency into the shopping process as people are getting approved and are looking to go buy and making offers. If they take a lot of time to submit a bunch of offers, just testing the market out, some people seem to like to do that and write offers that are a little low and see what doesn't happen. They could put themselves into a place where the volatility of rates is really going to bite them. So I think part of the education process that we're doing with buyers and that I would recommend is just talking about the fact that interest rates are moving around, and that the more time that's spent figuring out what to do, the more likelihood there is of seeing that interest rate turn a little negative on them and actually cost them some money. A lot of people seem to have been wanting to wait until the fall because I think the reasonable expectation was that rates would drop this fall. I don't know that that's going to be accurate any longer based on what we're seeing now. And the Fed may take no action at all between now and the end of the year based on what we're seeing, their comments coming out currently. So the wait for rates to come down mentality is probably not going to be a winning solution for people. If you have any questions specifically on that, of course, I'm happy to get into more detail or answer or give you the tools and information we're using to educate people. But I think that conversation is probably useful to have just to set the right expectation for buyers going in.
If I lock my rate today and 3 days from now it drops 0.25%, can I relock at a lower rate?
That's a great question. We get asked that a lot. So what you're talking about is a renegotiation. As a broker, we work with 27 different underwriters, and some of those underwriters will allow for a renegotiation. So if interest rates improve significantly, you can essentially renegotiate the rate down. What you won't be able to do is get the full improvement of the interest rate. You'll get some partial version of that. So there has to be a pretty significant improvement in rates to be able to renegotiate lower, generally speaking. The trade-off is, as a broker, again, we work with multiple banks. The banks that will allow a renegotiation during the process are also going to start with a little bit higher interest rate to begin with. So you kind of have to pick your poison and decide when you're locking a rate, do we want to work with the bank that does not allow a renegotiation, but gives a little bit better cost based on the lock that we have right now? Or do we want to play that a little bit and maybe go to a bank that we do have the option to renegotiate, knowing that if rates don't improve, we'll be paying a little bit more than what we needed to? You kind of get to pick your poison again. There's no free lunch. So you're going to pay one way or the other, but there is an option to do that if people think that's a real concern. And a lot of banks advertise and say, we'll renegotiate, but that's because they're just starting at a higher point to begin with.
Yeah. Is this a discussion you have with buyers when you're talking with them and saying, okay, when we find a rate that gives you a payment that you're comfortable with, here's when you would consider locking it in, and here's what this means. Do you have that discussion to educate them?
I do upfront a lot. And another thing I think that's useful to know in this is there are options, they'll call them lock and shop or forward locks or different things, where you could go in and lock an interest rate today for, let's say, 90 days without an address. You say, okay, I want to lock my rate in on a property that I'm going to buy in the next 3 to 4 months. And that's something that we offer as well, but I recommend against it. The longer you lock an interest rate, the more expensive it becomes. So if somebody's going to lock for 30 days versus 120 days, it's more expensive. And the more risk there is, the more expensive it becomes. So if a bank is going to offer a lock for a longer period of time with no address, that's a little bit higher risk for them. So you're going to pay a premium to get it. The only time that would make sense is if we were in a rapidly rising rate environment where rates were going to go up by more than 0.5%, where, if we were going to go from, now we're at 6.75 today to 8% or something like that, that lock and shop rate would be about in the middle. But if rates are doing the same volatility that we talked about, where we're kind of in the middle between the highest and the lowest right now, that lock and shop, it will bring some comfort, but they're going to pay an upfront fee to do it, generally speaking. And most of the time, they would have been better waiting until they're under contract and then watching the market to lock it in. So for clients that are really nervous, they just want to know, I want to know exactly what my payment's going to be. There is that solution, but you just have to go in knowing it's going to be more expensive than you taking the risk on yourself, because now you're offloading that risk onto the bank. Did I answer that question, Aaron?
Yes.
You can, and some people might need it, but it's not always the best solution.
Okay. Thanks, Alan. I appreciate you joining us and
Yeah.
sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks, guys, and
All
thanks
right,
for you,
guys,
Eric.
thanks.
For that.
Thanks for joining me today for this training. We'll get these forms out to you, and make sure that you're incorporating form study as a regular part, or just general study as a regular part of your activities. I encourage for brand new agents to be in there studying their forms every single day for 30 minutes a day. There's a long list of forms. You need to know the tools that are in your toolbox. So read the name of the form. If you don't know exactly what's in it, pull it up and read through it in detail. If you're an experienced agent, make form study at least a half hour a week, where you're pulling up, you're checking to see if there's any changes to forms. With me, I quite often go in, because of my position, I'm going into state law and reading state law, some of the details behind that, so that I can better serve my clients, which are you guys, right? So this is how we stay on top of the business, keep sharpening the saw. And it is important to stay up there. Some of the worst problems I've seen are from brokers that have been in the industry for 40 years that were giving poor advice to their agents based on outdated knowledge. And thankfully, we've got Rebecca here. She's on the education committee. She goes to a lot of classes. I've done trainings where Rebecca's texted me 5 minutes after the training, said, "Oh, by the way, did you know this form has changed?" And I'm like, damn it, I didn't know that. And so, I mean, I make this an active part of my business. Training is very important to me, and I still get caught up in it. That's why I'm encouraging you guys to be actively involved in, because even if you're trying to be active, there's a lot going on in the world. We're going to see a lot of changes, and it's going to leave you behind if you don't make a concerted effort to be on top of things. All right. So I appreciate you guys joining us. I appreciate Rebecca for keeping a sharp eye on me and keeping me honest in these trainings. And thank you guys. And I don't know if you hear that. That's my new dog thumping under the table. Could you guys hear that? No?
No.
Sounds like I've got Thumper the rabbit right here. Anyways, thanks you guys for joining me today. And if you have any questions or something moving forward, don't hesitate to reach out to me.